Hi, this is Rick for EDU Mobile. Now we're going to talk about activities and layouts and the relationship between them. So an activity corresponds, as we already said, to the controller in a model view controller design pattern, whereas layouts correspond to the views. So for a control in a layout to be accessible to an activity, in other words, for a control in a view to be accessible to a controller, it must have an ID, and this field is called ID. Now, not all controls need an ID. For example, the general layout, typically does not have an ID. Only the controls that we're going to say are active, or we want to change a value, or we want to respond to some sort of button press, or something like that, need to have an ID. So controls, for example, that just display static text and that text never changes and it's set in the layout, those controls do not need an ID. Controls defined completely in code may not need to have an ID, but if another control defined in the code needs to reference a control that was also defined in the code, then that first control will need to have an ID. So anytime you need to reference a control, whether it's created in code or it's sitting on the layout, anytime you need to reference a control from the activity, that control needs to have an ID. So what is a control ID? First of all, to define a new ID in a layout XML file, we use the syntax Android ID equals a string containing @ plus and then ID / and then whatever we call the control, the name of the control. Now, underneath the hood, this is not a string, it's an integer. But we refer to these guys, these IDs, by their string name. The @ symbol tells the parser of the XML in the layout parser to expand the string and to create a resource. So when it does that, first of all, it creates a 32-bit integer. And it creates it in a file called r.java, which is located in the build folder in the structure of your app. The name of the int will be whatever the control name is that we assign in this Android ID string up above. The plus symbol says this is a new ID, and normally, almost all the time, we use that plus symbol within our XML files. We will cover the very rare cases when we don't use the plus separately and much later. Okay, so now we know what a control ID is and how to create it in a layout file. How do we access those IDs within the activity? Well, we already mentioned r.java. R, by the way, stands for resource, but r.java is going to be linked with your application. And it basically is a class that contains inner classes, each of which contains a collection of IDs that have been defined. So controls in a layout can be accessed using the activity's findViewById method, and then we pass it the resource ID. So the resource ID is going to differ depending on what kind of resource it is, but if it's a layout ID, if it's an ID defined in a layout, that is going to be r.id the name of the control, or the actual name that we gave the ID. In other words, the string reference to that underlying integer value. So, for instance, if we have an edit text that we want to find an ID for in our activity, we would use syntax like this. First of all, it's an edit text, so type edit text and then name, whatever we want to refer to it in code. Here it's my edit text is equal to, and then findViewId r.id.myEditText. Now notice that we have to cast the findViewById return value to whatever type it is we're looking for. Here it's an edit text. findViewById returns the superclass of all these controls, which is view. So it's returning a class, it's returning an object of type view. So we have to downcast that view to whatever it is that we actually want. Now, other things have IDs as well. Resources have IDs. So resources are things like images and strings and values that we want to provide in XML files and then access either in our layout or directly in our code. These are also listed in r.java. So in the layout XML file, to get to, let's say, a resource ID, we use @ and then the package name only if it's in a different package, and then the resource type and the name of the resource. So if the resource is in the same package as the layout, we can omit and should omit the package name. The type, the resource type, is going to be listed in r.java, and it corresponds to the folders under the resource. For example, string resources have the type string. Now, that is and isn't directly true, but the string folder, for instance, is under the resource values folder, or the string file. So in the hierarchy of the application, it's res/values/strings string.xml. The resource names can be any string, anything we want to call the resource. They are declared in the relevant XML file for each type of resource. So let's look at an example. Suppose we have a string that we want to define here called, the string name is button text. This becomes a resource, and this is located in the resource values strings XML file. Now, any string defined in any file under values with a root node of resources is going to come up in the strings list. So r.string is going to find any string in any file. By default, we put these in strings XML, but we could call it whatever name we want to .xml, and it would still find it. So I'm saying that strings XML here is the default. So for instance, we have this little strings XML file, and we have added a string, and the way we do that is string name equals, we use the name attribute, and then whatever we want to call it, and this is the resource name, and then close that, and then the actual value of that string. And we notice we don't put text, or we don't put quotes around that string. That's clear text. This is an XML entity. So then we finally close the string tag, the string element here. So now we have a new resource named button text, which is of type string and has the value test. All right, so I've put that up at the top here in the title so that we can refer to it as we access it in the layout XML file. Now, if you looked at the layout XML files, you'll see that often we have an opening for a type. Here it's button. And then we have the close at the bottom, or at the end of the file, or at the end of the entity. And then we have a bunch of Android attributes. Our attributes are all in the Android, well, most of them, let's say, are in the Android namespace. So here, the red line is what we're interested in, Android text. Now, rather than just putting test in there in a string, which we could do, but we really don't want to. We want to go to strings XML. The syntax for doing this within the layout XML is @string and then button text, which is the name of our string. So this will set this button's text to the string TEST, capital TEST, test. Now notice I've also grabbed and highlighted the Android ID. You can see that. And also look at Android layout below that attribute, and it refers to another ID called text view. So this says this button in the layout will appear below that text view, and this becomes very important later. There is something I'm doing in the demo that you want to pay attention to, but this is a layout attribute that we can also set up in code. So here, the string resource from strings XML is used as a button's Android text attribute. So that's great. What if we want to create a new button in our code? How would we access that? So we have the string resource. How do we do that? We use getString or getText with the address within r.java. So here, that would still be r.string.buttonText. Now, if we use getString, we're going to get a raw Java string. But if we use getText, This retains any rich text styling that we applied to the string. There are other resource types, obviously. There are images, and there are values, and there are all kinds of things. So they have different r.java addresses. You can get the resource type names from r.java. You can look at it, but never edit r.java. It is built for us by the Android system. If we edit it, all kinds of bad things can potentially happen. So don't change it, but you can use it to see what those attribute names are. It is located at build source r debug, and then whatever the name of the package is, r.java, in the file hierarchy, for your app. Thank you very much.